What's up, Brad?
Hey Ulysses, how you doing?
I'm good, man. Glad we could work it out.
Yeah, I'm glad things worked out this way, that you were able to do the show, and I really appreciate you doing it because,
Thanks for having me, man.
yeah, man, I'm excited to talk to you. I'm a big fan of your work. I love your album Falling Forwards, especially that version of Evidence you do on there. I
Oh, thank
love
you, man.
your work with Christian McBride, and you just have such an amazing feel. All these little things. I mean, as a appreciator of the rhythm section, that I want to talk about with you, and I'm glad we get to have a little conversation and do it. But
Thank you.
I wanted to start off by asking you just, how have you been doing? How has the gigging life been treating you, especially in this time of the pandemic where everything is probably a little very different from what it has been for you.
Well, man, it's been a hell of a year and a half. I was thinking about that the other day, going back to like March of 2020, and just seeing this whole journey. But I always say to people, I'm thankful for a lot of things. Obviously, I lost a lot of gigs and stuff like everybody, but it also allowed me to be clearer about what I wanted to do when things opened back up, and it also allowed me to create new things. Like one of the first things that I did was I built a studio in Florida, a production studio where I can record my drums, and as a result of doing that, man, it opened up this whole other space for me to record content, and collaborate with various brands and stuff. So that was really cool. I didn't even sort of see that coming. I kind of started it out as just a way to stay busy and to have a place to play, and and develop, and to not let my chops fall. And then it turned into this whole other entity. And now, literally, now that the world is opened back up, I've got all the other things I'm doing, and now I have this studio that I can work out of. So that's been really great. And then also during that time, I started a jam session back in October of last year in Jacksonville at a place called Wild Crafters. It's a non-alcoholic bar. And it was, again, I just wanted to play. I was like, man, it's been, 6 months. I hadn't really played. Also, I hadn't really played for an audience because I was doing all this content stuff and, Zoom and, making, these kind of recordings where we're putting things together section by section. And so I was like, I want to go back to like old school creating. So anyway, man, I started this jam session and it turned into like a hit, man. And we would have anywhere from 75 to 100 people every Sunday, and I got a chance to meet all these incredible young musicians. And then I started posting clips, of it on Instagram, and then I started getting all these other musicians that started coming through Florida, to be part of it. So yeah, so it was great. And then my writing, I had a right when the pandemic began, I was releasing my brush book, and by the time it was sort of coming out of we were coming out of the weeds, my entrepreneurship book was being released. So I started doing a bunch of promo for that. So I say all that to say that, like, what first started off as like, oh my God, I can't go on the road, which was kind of probably 70 to 80% of how I made my income, that closed down. But then it opened up 3 or 4 other terrains of ways to not only make an income, but to make impact and keep the music alive in ways that I probably would not have searched or been open to exploring had this not happened. So yeah, man, it's been a journey, but one that I'm really grateful for because I've learned a lot.
Yeah, man, that's great to hear. I mean, obviously, just what I hear in your music, you seem so driven. It's not surprising that you would just continue working hard through whatever life throws at you. But was there any time where it was difficult to keep your routine or the momentum going in your work? And do you have any advice for other musicians in staying with their regiment and getting to their goals
Sure.
and making plans like that?
Yeah, I would say probably the toughest time for me, to be completely transparent, was the initial, I would say, March till about May or June. Because that, for many of us, we were like, oh, this will be a few weeks. Oh, it'll be a few months. And then by the time we got to the summer, we pretty much realized that as a society that we weren't going to be done with this in the year. Right. So
Yeah.
you all of a sudden, like my January to March 2020 was incredible. I mean, I say people oftentimes I did everything that they told me not to do for COVID because I didn't know. I was on a cruise ship. I was in London. I was in I was in Saudi Arabia. I mean, I was everywhere. So that coming off the heels of like going, teaching, barely having enough time to sit still, to all of a sudden it shuts down. That was a rough period for me. So, I always tell the joke, man. My Instagram stories, I was getting up at like 10 o'clock making cocktails. Like I didn't know what the hell to do. So, so it was rough. And then financially, like you go from touring and making money and you're good. Like I didn't have to. I hadn't been in a place in over 15 years where I was like worried about work or worried about like what was coming next. And all of a sudden you go from not worrying about that in 15 years to all of a sudden like, oh, well, what's in my savings? And like, what, like, okay, wow, okay, I can last this long, having those conversations with yourself. But I would say, to your advice, the first thing I would say is that you have to be in touch with yourself. If COVID didn't teach any of us one thing, it taught us you have to tune into you, right? And you have to tune in, whether it's tune into your body and make sure you're not sick, tune into your mental health, and make sure that your whatever levels of anxiety that all of us were dealing with, whether it was going to the grocery store and having to spray all your groceries, to you want to go somewhere but you're afraid if you touch somebody you get COVID. So I think it really taught me I've got to tune into me, and I've also got to figure out what can I do daily to regulate the anxiety, because I feel like I've never been an anxious person, but I think after COVID, everybody is dealing with anxiety.
Yeah.
Like everybody. And so I think the second part of that was the mental health piece was, meditating, exercising, and just being active. Like for me, when I'm not active, I feel sedentary. And when I feel like that, I feel like life's not moving. So I think those are really important things for me. And then the other thing was gratefulness. Is really being grateful for what had happened, because I the things that have happened in my life are a surprise to me and are a blessing to me. And before the new phase of things that will happen occur, sometimes you've got to look back at what has occurred, and that can give you faith in what is in the future for you. So I would say like those three things of like really tuning into yourself and not being afraid of yourself, and also not being afraid to go into those dark corners of things that you're going through and acknowledging them as opposed to avoiding them. And then obviously the mental health piece, and then being grateful. And ironically, as I started to do that, I started looking at opportunities that were right in front of me, and then that was how I started to chart like what my next step was. Because I think from March to April, I was just like, oh, when am I gigging again? When am I gigging again? And when I finally like accepted, like I'm probably not going to be gigging again for a while, I then was able to like say, okay, well, what do I have? And then from assessing what was around me, I then created a whole new world. So now it's funny to me because, now things are back in action, and, I got gigs and tours and all that stuff getting lined up. And now I have to factor in all the other things I built. And so it's really great because now that tours are back, I don't necessarily have to tour in the same way that I did before, because I've now created these other avenues. So, those are some levels of advice I would give.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine it can be tough to balance all of that, but it's also in some ways it probably gives you more choice in what you're doing, and it's cool that you have the options and that you can tackle writing, you can tackle producing, you can tackle recording at home. So I don't know, it's inspiring to hear people who are really like making the best of it and getting a lot of things going, because that's what I've been trying to do through all this too.
Yeah, man. I think you have to. I mean, I've always been a multitasker, but it goes back to that first thing of what do you want? And I think for me, if I could sort of surmise everything and that I've wanted in life, is I want ultimately freedom. I want freedom to do what I want to do. You know what I mean? Because I feel like when you sit down and play, and you play from a place of I'm doing this because I want to do it, and not because, okay, I'm making $500 a night and that's going to help me, make five of the $1,200 that I need to make to pay rent. Like that's a completely different motivation. And I know for me, before the pandemic, I was very, like, I loved the gigs I was doing, but I was very like economically like focused. I was like, okay, this gig pays this, that gig pays this, like, cause I was also like living in New York primarily, which New York is such a money town, in terms of like, it's so expensive. So I also moved to Florida. I shifted my home base from being in New York to Florida literally a few months before the pandemic. So that was another thing that like was great, because I could actually like look at opportunities and say like, do I really want to do this? And like, is my heart into this, or is this like a money thing? And so now that's really how I make decisions, because moving to Florida allowed me to cut my overhead financially and allowed me to like really, be able to sit down and say, okay, like all I need to do is, one gig, and that takes care of what I need, versus New York, I had to do 20 gigs, so you're able to really stay connected to that creative flow, because all your decisions are being made from that place.
Yeah, and when you're really only doing the ones you want, it doesn't feel like a gig. It just feels like you're doing what you're meant to do.
Exactly.
But I'm definitely interested to know more about the Florida scene, because I know you grew up in Jacksonville, and I was curious to know, what's the music scene like down there by you, but also how has it changed since you were young?
Well, man, so first of all, I would say, like, I'll start kind of in reverse. When I was young, Jacksonville, I didn't get into jazz until I was like maybe 12, 13. And then I started playing around town. I was about 16. And I would say right off the bat, Jacksonville has a reputation for incredible players. People like Marcus Prentup, who's been with Winton for many years, went to UNF. Vincent Gardner went to University of North Florida. A lot of great players that are moving around the world and doing great things. Went to University of North Florida. But then you also had like Winton, like especially in the 90s, we had a club in Jacksonville called Partners, and one also called Juice and Java. And Juice and Java was like a hang for like Marcus Roberts and Winton. And I mean, during that time, much of Winton's band was actually full of a bunch of like hybrid Florida, Georgia, like Southern guys. So like Wycliffe Gordon, who went to FAMU, and the Wycliffe would pass through Fort Jacksonville all the time. So I think that, Jacksonville has always been kind of this place that never really got a lot of dap, like Miami, but there's definitely like a great sort of energy there, and really great, a lot of great players. And there was always some place to play. Yeah. We also have the Jacksonville Jazz Festival, which just turned 40. So we have a history of really great, festivals and things like that, so that's been cool. But I would say what's deep now is like coming back home, especially when I started playing the jam session, I realized that we still have a lot of talented musicians, but what's interesting is that they all are hybrid players. So like New York, you'll meet a drummer who just swings, you'll meet like your Mark Whitfield Jr. or like, some of these other cats, TJ Reddick, like some of these young cats out here, they just swing and they play a power gig swinging. Jacksonville, that same drummer will have a church gig on Sunday. They also will be doing like hip hop production, making beats during the week. They also will be playing like, wedding band gigs and playing the click tracks and overdubbing, drums or whatever. And then they'll be swinging. Yeah. So it's really interesting because like when I moved back to Jacksonville and I started playing in Jacksonville, it made me become more versatile. Like in New York, I was always, known as like a jazz guy, but I've also gotten into like the session and kind of Broadway scene a little bit, like where a lot of those Broadway guys, even though I wasn't in a Broadway show, but they would call me to play gigs or do recordings because they're like, wow, Ulysses is solid. So I'd always been versatile from that perspective. But when I got back to Jacksonville, it was like, oh no, this is how to play like a hip hop funk groove. Or here's how to play like a trap groove. So going back home was great because what I bought was cats coming to me being like, oh, shoot, that's what swing really sounds like, and then them telling me like, hey, this is what funk really sounds like, or this is what hip hop, or here's what Southern funk sounds like. So I love it, man, because I feel like all the players in Jacksonville are really talented, but they're also versatile, which means that they taught me that. But I think what they lack is sort of the specific focus. But they're great, man, and they work a lot, and they're flexible. And I also learned moving back home and in Jacksonville, I learned how to play for audiences that don't know anything about what you're doing. Because like living in New York for all these years, you know, whether you're playing at Mesro or playing at, Sophia's, the Italian restaurant, or if you're playing at Dizzy's or the Vanguard, you're dealing with, decade like listeners that understand what you're doing, and they kind of know what you're going to do before you do it. And you got sold out lines across the street, to hear you play. And so, you're kind of a little bit of a celebrity. When I went home, it was like, oh yeah, I heard that you do cool things, but like, I'm just coming to hear music. And people may be like, oh, well, I don't really know who you are, but you're really talented and I really enjoy you and I'm coming back next week. So it really taught me how to like craft a set for like the common person and get a lot of ordinary people who are not jazz listeners into jazz, which I think will help me in terms of building my larger audience versus New York kind of, is a niche market for a niche audience. So you kind of learn, you're sort of preaching to the choir in New York. Yeah. So being in Florida was great, or has been great for that reason.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely know what you mean about trying to connect with audience members who don't necessarily listen to, jazz or, regular improvisation or, just the general canon of like Black American music. I feel like there's like some connection there that a lot of listeners of, even if they're really pigeonholed into like, oh, they only like classic rock or this, there's a way to connect with them. But I feel like that's like one of my favorite parts of improvisation is finding that connection with the specific audience you have to play for.
Right.
Like when it comes to improvising, do you feel like like in a within jazz you've been able to kind of take those other styles that you've been learning more about, and have they influenced the way that you play, say, swing? Like, has a hip hop rhythm kind of made its way into the vocabulary you use in swing, and do you feel like that like aids you in your connection with those audiences?
Absolutely. I mean, I feel way more grounded now when I play. Like I feel like before, like I used to play like really on top of the beat, and I feel like I had that New York edge, which is what like a lot of drummers want, particularly here, which is that real like sort of snap, crackle, pop, like just really being able to like have that edge to your playing. Moving to Florida, it was like, okay, you're more relaxed because, when you play gigs in New York, you're taking, an Uber, you're taking, 2 subways and, you walk 10 blocks. Like, so you're kind of always on edge because everything with the lifestyle is on edge versus, Florida, man, I drive up, I got a parking garage or parking space, I get to load my stuff, take my time loading my gear in, like just the whole thing is easier. So I think so I relaxed a lot more. And even my swing, though I know how to like put that edge on it, but I think it's rounder, I think it's fuller, and I think it's more settled. And then my groove stuff, I think is just deeper and it's a little bit, it's heavier. Like it's, like when I play a groove now, like cats like, oh shit, Yeah. And I think that's from being in Florida and like also being around these young drummers who they don't necessarily have the facility and knowledge I have, but when I hear them, I'm like, damn, like they're playing a deep pocket. And so I hear, it's in my ear now. And so like, that's what I'm reaching for when I play grooves versus I think being in New York, it's a different kind of groove. So I think going back to Florida got more of that Southern depth and bottom into my sound that I think I kind of lost, I think, moving to New York, versus, but the other thing is like, you have to sacrifice, like, if you want to be in New York and you want to play, like you've got to adapt to like the scene here, so I think my playing is starting to have that hybrid, like that bridge, kind of reconnecting to my roots, so.
Now, when it comes to the histories of hip hop and funk, and I guess like other Southern styles, like stuff out of New Orleans,
right?
Is there like any particular artists that have had a big influence on how you conceptualize rhythm and have like kind of formed like your favorite types of grooves?
I mean, I would say like, I got a chance to study with Herlin Riley for a year in New York. And Herlin is one of the greatest drummers and actually historians of the music. And I would say like, when it comes to teaching me like New Orleans music and like the early tradition of just like jazz drumming, like, Baby Doss, Sick Hat, like that true, like kind of early swing stuff, like, Herlin really helped me to understand that, and he demonstrates that. Like when you hear Herlin play, like you hear like the early tradition of jazz drumming, and then you hear all like the other innovative things that he does. So I think Herlin was definitely like a huge thing, opened me up musically with that. Also, I would say I grew up in church.
Yeah.
So, listening to all the great gospel drummers, from groups like the Winans and Commission and, all the great gospel choir drummers, this is like what Eric Harlan and I love to call pre-Pro Tools church, because church now is pretty much the same as, in terms of what the musicians are doing. They're doing the same thing that they're doing for, these R&B and pop acts.
Yeah.
Same process, building stems and all that kind of stuff. But the era I grew up in was where, it was just a drummer and an organist, or maybe a drummer, organist, and a bass player, so it was a different kind of vibe. And so I feel like in that regard, I learned a lot about like orchestrating and a lot about like why I play as opposed to just playing for, any kind of reason. So definitely the gospel influence is in my sound. The rolling stuff is in my sound. And then I think in general, like the versatility, like my ability to play, like on my big band record, like my ability to go from 2-bass hit to like Soul Conversations to then, Human Nature, like that's what, as I said earlier, that's what you did in Florida. Like you played all these different things. So I think that's a huge part of my playing is my versatility. Yeah. And I don't think if I grew up in New York, I think I would have probably been more specific. Like you look at a guy like a great drummer like Marcus Gilmore, who grew up playing jazz because he heard his grandfather. And obviously he's incredibly innovative, but like he's an incredible, innovative jazz drummer, because he was literally baptized in it, versus other drummers like, whether it's even Justin Brown had a similar background to me. Justin and I both grew up in church, and we both grew up playing, especially you play in cities that aren't like metropolitan cities, where the idea of music could be at like a barbecue restaurant. It could be at a reggae, in a reggae band. Like in 1 week, you're going to play with 7 different types of bands because the sort of utilization of music, or, is more for entertainment and not so much for like consumption or like artistic consumption, like it is like in places, like New York, Miami, LA, San Francisco, things like that. So yeah, I think all those things has contributed to the kind of drummer that I am and that I'm becoming.
Yeah. Well, like you said, you do like show a lot of diversity, and I feel like it's becoming more and more apparent with your newer albums. I did want to touch on Soul Conversations a little bit. It's really like amazing arrangements. I was curious, who did the arrangements on the album? Are you into arranging, or do you leave that totally to someone else?
Man, I'm smart because I delegate.
Yeah, I feel like that's like something you got to do after a certain point.
Well, yeah, I mean, so for me, I'm about doing stuff on a high level, right? So like, I feel like I'm blessed to be a drummer that can play, that's talented. I'm, a talented producer. I know I'm a talented music director, and I know how to shape things, and I know how to bring concepts to life. But I'm not a great composer. I'm not a great arranger. So I think when you know what you're good at, then you can focus on that, and then have others who are great at arranging and composition help you. And then now you get to create a great A-level project versus, these people who are like, oh, I produced it and I directed and I filmed it and I was the cinematographer. I'm like, well, that's probably a sad-ass project.
Yeah.
Because there's no way that there's no way you can be great at all of those things. There's probably one of those things that you're great at, and you're sort of sabotaging yourself by wanting to run everything else. But anyway, I digress. So my arrangers, one of my big partners is Michael Dees, who's a great trombonist and arranger. And so Dees did a couple of arrangements, like he did 2-bass hit. Also had Stephen Feifke, who's a talented big band leader and arranger. He arranged a couple things for me. Like he did London Town and Harlem. Then there's another great arranger, Danny Giannacucci. There's also Diego Rivera, Michael Thomas. So yeah, Yasushi, was an incredible writer, composer and arranger. So I just kind of looked at the people that were in my group, in my band, and and a lot of them, like for instance, Yasushi, other than college, he had never put any of his big band arrangements out. But I remember in college, we were in like arranging class together, and I remember him being a talented arranger. So like when I got ready to put the band together, I emailed everybody. I was like, hey, if anybody, I'm collecting arrangements. If anybody wants to get their music played, like, let me know. And Yasushi hit me up. He's like, yo, man, I got 2 charts. I would love for you to check out. And I was like, really? And one was Language of Flowers, which is absolutely gorgeous. And the other was Girl Talk, which was like, you know, a Neil Hefti tune, but it was just a little cool arrangement. And to this day, like, a lot of people like go crazy over both of those arrangements on the record. So I think where my music director and producer chops came out was I started reaching out to people that others had not. Like at that time, Danny Chandakuchi, aside from his own big band, wasn't really, his arrangements weren't really getting played by like anybody established yet. So like I was one of the first to break his arrangement. Same Stephen Feifke. Diego has had a lot of experience with big band writing, and so has Michael Thomas. But some of the others had not. So I think this record is kind of their foray into people being able to hear their arrangements at large.
Yeah, man. I mean, it's a really amazing lineup you have. I kind of figured Michael Deese had a hand in those arrangements. I'm a big fan of his last album was amazing. I love Stephen Feifke. His arrangement of Isn't She Lovely that he did for Chad Lefkowitz Brown is so good, and I've had Stephen on the show. He's such a great guy. But it really is such an amazing sounding album. I mean, like I'm more into listening to like smaller combos, but it really is like a fantastic sounding record. I'm gonna play a little bit of it on the show, but you know, how long was this? Were you working on this album? Was this a thing you were already planning on doing pre-pandemic, or did the pandemic have an influence on it?
Oh yeah, it was definitely pre-pandemic. I mean, I started playing. I kind of formed that big band out of a joke because Mike Dees had been telling me I need to start it, and I was like, Mike, it ain't gonna work. I said, but I'll at least do it one night. You know, at Dizzy's, I had like a run with my combo, and so I was like, all right, I'll just try it, and I did like three nights or 3 or 4 nights at Dizzy's, and then like one night I was like, all right, I can afford to lose money for one night, so I did the big band, and everybody came up to me, they were like, no shade, but this is the best thing I've ever heard you do. And I'm like, what? You know? And so then Disney's hit me up and they were like, yeah, man, so we give you a week every year. Can you do like just big band next year? I was like, shit. And then so we did so I did the one night, then Dizzy's, so that must have been probably like 2017. And then like 18, Dizzy's gave me like the 4 nights with just big band. And people came back again. I was like, damn, this band is killing. And then 2018, I was like, I'm going to record the set. Like, I'm going to record at least a couple nights. And I was like, maybe, they put it out or something. I didn't really know what I was going to do yet, but I knew I wanted to record it. And I recorded it, but it just wasn't ready. Like, we weren't ready, man. It was it was spirited and definitely had a lot of energy and beauty, but the shit was raggedy. And then the next year, 2019, Mike Dees was like, all right, we're going to record and we're going to make a record. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to do some sectionals. We're going to, he like had a plan. He was like, here's how we get a record. And he was like, record every night and we're going to go through this, when we have time. And we're going to like pick the best cuts and we're going to edit. We're going to, basically do the surgery. So I'd already decided 2019 that I was going to record the band, and everybody knew, and everybody was like really on their P's and Q's. So we recorded it, and then we were planning to shop it to some labels, and we shopped it to a few labels, and a lot of them were interested, but nobody really wanted to pull the trigger. And finally, it was Outside In that was like, Ulysses, we've been hearing about this record for a while. Like we want it. We know we're not a big label, but we really want this record. And so that's when I started talking strategy with them. And then the pandemic came out because we'd already said we wanted to release it like maybe like May or something like that. And then the pandemic happened. And so I was like, what's up, guys? You think we should still do this? And they were like, absolutely. But I said, well, let's make sure we do it towards maybe the end of May, because I said maybe we'll kind of be out of the weeds. And it was actually perfect timing because my record was one of the few that came out that kind of like as the pandemic was ending, people were like starting to be open to checking out stuff versus like people who release records like January, February, like we were still like not even vaccinated. Like, we were still in like the news cycle of the pandemic. But by the time May came about, people were ready to like sort of get on the other side of this. So yeah, it was planned before the pandemic, but the timing and all that, we were sort of working it out as it was happening.
Yeah. Now are you already kind of looking towards doing more recordings with the big band, or do you have your sights on like another project with your combo? Do you have, like, do you know what's going to be next?
Yeah, so I already, I don't know if you're aware, but I have this band called Generation Y, and it's basically full of my students. It's, Alexa Tarantino on saxophone, Drew Ashby Anderson on trumpet, Luther Allison on piano, and Phil Norris on bass. Pretty much half of that group I met at Juilliard. And we just got back from Switzerland. We did a week in Switzerland end of September, and it was incredible. And so that band is killing, and we got a bunch of touring lined up actually next year. From pretty much like from February, because we got like some big band gigs, and then we start pretty much with the quintet gigs, pretty much like February, March, April. Got a big tour and all that. So in terms of recording, my dream is to record both Gen Y and the big band next year. Like, and the big band, I want to do a studio album. And so even I was just talking to my manager now, right before our call, like, I really want a label, situation that can allow me to put, record this music on a high level and put it out into the world. So I'm aiming for fall 2022. To start recording and hopefully, have a great deal with a label that I can put this music out through. So that's what I hope to be next in terms of my recording. And then, we got, Dizzy's actually with my big band. We're playing in December. We're doing a week celebrating, the album release. And then, and then, like I said, from February on, we got a bunch of leader gigs and things, coming through the pipeline. So I'm excited.
Awesome, man. Yeah, I'm excited to hear more. I also want to touch quickly on your podcast. I'm so excited to hear this new episode you got out with Chris Dave. But why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about what you're doing with your podcast and
sure,
hopefully convince them to check it out.
Yeah, man. So it's actually a live YouTube series. I called it a podcast. But it's a live YouTube series, and it's called From the Drummer's Perspective, and it's in association with Open Studio Network. And they are a really great online jazz online lesson platform that is primarily focused on, people learning jazz through like sort of the online lessons. So I call it like the masterclass series for jazz. So I've got 3 courses with them. One is called The Art of Swing with Ruben Rogers, where it's basically bass and drums, and we're talking about, jazz and how to, hook up and, keep the foundation of a rhythm section together. My first course with them is called Finding Your Beat, which is, 3.5 hours of just like material about, my philosophy and also how to play jazz drumming and, all that kind of stuff. And then the most recent course, which is coming out soon, which I'm really excited about, it's a mini course, and it's called Jazz Drumming 101, Everything You Need to Know to Get the Gig. And so it's really more entrepreneurially focused on like, okay, here, if you want to work as a drummer, here are things you need to know and understand to be able to do that. So anyway, so in the process of doing the course and all that, Peter and them came to me and they were like, yo, man, like, we've seen a couple of your interviews, because when I came out, released Soul Conversations, I decided to do like some Instagram live interviews. And so they watched a few of them. They were like, man, you're a really great interviewer. Like, would you ever do a series? And I was like, absolutely. And so we came up with From the Drummer's Perspective, which was essentially about interviewing well-known drummers, particularly kind of in jazz, about their process, and some of the greatest drummers like Peter Erskine or Eric Harlan or Nate Smith, and like really kind of do a behind the scenes of like, all right, this is not a 10-minute interview about gear. This is like what's your process? Who inspired you? Who's the first person, to give you a pair of drumsticks? Who's the first person that, helped you to decipher like the kind of sound you want to have? Like one of my favorite interviews is one I did with Nishi Waits, where I got to really talk to him about his process. So anyway, that's what I plan to do tomorrow with Chris Dave, who's this incredible drummer. But being able to kind of have this, sort of 60-minute intimate conversation with him, where we get to really dig into whatever level of the process he wants to share with us. So it's exciting. So I've been doing that since mid-June, and we actually will be going till the end of November. Then we're taking a short break for the holiday, and then hopefully, we can get some more great artists on there and talk to them about their perspective.
Yeah, man. Well, like I said, I'm really looking forward to hearing the interview with Chris Dave. I saw you had Daru Jones on recently, and
Yeah, Daru is
I
great.
love his playing too. I mean, it's a really awesome lineup. I guess you've been having on, so I can't
Thank
recommend
you,
it
man.
enough to the listeners. Um, I had a few more things I want to touch on before we
Sure.
wrap stuff up. If I'm holding you too long,
No, you're good.
but I was curious to know, as a bassist, I'm a huge fan of Christian McBride.
Of
So I
course.
was wondering if you could tell me how you got the gig with him, and also if there's any big lessons that you learned through your time with him.
Well, McBride is funny, man. I was interviewing Peter Erskine, and the funny thing is I asked him about his time with Weather Report, and he kind of didn't want to talk about it because I guess it's the thing that he gets asked about the most.
Yeah.
I actually feel the exact opposite because I I owe so much of who I am now as a leader to McBride because he essentially allowed me to watch him for 7 years. And from watching him for 7 years, it informed me of like what I wanted to do and how I could do it. And I will always give him that because he showed me that it was possible. Because before McBride, um, leaders were always like trumpet players or vocalists or whatever. But he actually showed me like as a rhythm section player, like you can be a leader. So anyway, so I will always be grateful to him for that. In terms of how I got the gig, kind of long story short, I've been going to Jazz Aspen Snowmass for a while, which is a camp that he had in Colorado. And the last time, so I'd done it like as a college student, and then when I graduated, I got a call from Sharnae Wade, who's now on faculty with me at Juilliard. But she had a band, and she was like, "Hey, I got invited to go out to Aspen. They're doing this kind of like alumni thing where they want a bunch of people who have been there before, like, to go again." And she was like, "Would you come with me?" And at the time, I was like, it's not really paying no money, Charnay. Like, I don't know if I can do that. And she was like, "Okay, well, let me know." And something said to me, it's not paying any money, but you also haven't seen Christian in a while. And you probably should just see him again,
Yeah.
So I was like, all right. So I went, played, did the thing with Charnay. We had a great time. And by the end of the camp, he asked me to do a gig with him, like, as part of the camp. It was like a gig at somebody's house. And so we played with him, myself, and Uri Kane. And Yuri Kane. And so, man, we played, we had a good time. It was and so at the time I wasn't working a lot. And so I was like, "Hey, Christian, can I ask you a question?" I was like, "Man, how can I work more?" And he was like, "Well, what do you mean?" And so we like went through this whole thing of like how I felt like I wasn't working a lot or like I wasn't doing the kind of gigs I wanted to do. And so he gave me some really great advice. So anyway, man, right after that, it's great to see him, gave him a big old hug. And I was like, "Man, I hope to see you at some point." And then I got the gig with Kurt Elling, I think, and so we played Monterey Jazz Festival, and that same Monterey Jazz Festival, Christian had just started his new straight ahead band called Inside Straight. So and it was Carl Allen, Eric Reed, Steve Wilson, and Warren Wolf. So I got to see that band like on the stage. I was like, "Damn, like they sound good," Man, fast forward, I think like a few months later, Christian's manager called me. It was like, "Hey, man, Carl," because Carl had just gotten promoted to being the jazz, artistic director at Juilliard. And so he's like, "Hey, man, Carl is doing a bunch of stuff at Juilliard, and he can't make some of these dates. Why don't you come out here? Christian wants to know if you would come out and do these 2 tours." Well, no, one was just a West Coast tour. He's like, "Would you do the tour?" And I was like, "Heck yeah." So I was so excited. Cleared all the dates with Kurt and everything. And so I went and did this West Coast tour, and we played Kuma Jazz Festival. We played Denver. We played a bunch of places. And I never forget, man, like, the first gig we played together, you know, we did a sound check and we played the tune. I memorized all the tunes. And he stopped. He said, "Hey, man, lean back a little bit with your time." You know, I said, "Okay." After that, we never talked about anything else again. And we finished that tour. He said, I love your playing." He says, "Do you play big band?" I said, "Yeah, man. Actually, I got the call with Count Basie orchestra, but I kind of been waiting for that gig for a while. But Butch Miles decided to do it an extra year. And by the time Basie called, they did end up calling me to do the gig, but I had just gotten hired by Kurt. And so I was telling McBride all of that, and he was like, "Oh, so you play big band for real?" I was like, "Yeah." So he was like, "Hey, man, I'm just starting my big band. I would love for you to be the drummer." So we did a gig at the Iridium, and then we did a gig at Dizzy's, and it was so successful. And then we did his first big band record and got a Grammy. So it was weird because it went from like me just like subbing for Carl to like I had this other purpose of playing with his big band. Then from there, he started getting a lot of offers for the quintet that were a little bit too small for the quintet. So he decided to do a trio. And he called Gerald Clayton and myself. And so we did a gig, and people really liked that. Then we did some gigs with Peter Martin. And then after that, we met, Christian Sands. And then we put that was like, we were like, all right, me and McBride both again at Aspen saw Sands, and we both looked at each other like, oh shit, and so after that, man, the rest was history. So playing with him was great, man. It was 7 years of some really great music making, and he taught me a lot. I just actually talked to him about an hour ago via text. But yeah, man, it was very, very great.
Yeah, man, it's so cool. So cool to hear about, just the way things line up, especially that, like, going out on that trip for, like, the gig that you weren't sure would be worth it. I hear stories like that, and it's inspiring to hear just the way things happen to line up like that.
Sorry.
Oh yeah, it's cool. It's just really cool to hear how that kind of stuff comes together. And like I said, I'm a big fan of the playing you've done with him and on your albums. And it's just cool to hear more behind the scenes stuff about it.
Thank you.
And the one main thing I wanted to touch on before we got done was something I like to do with a lot of guests I have. I mostly have musicians on the show, but I also have a lot of stand-up comedians on the show. And I'm a huge stand-up comedy nerd, so I like to hear what the musicians are into as far as comedy goes, and what within the art of comedy has touched you as an artist.
Wow, that's a great question. I don't think I've ever been asked that before. Well, first of all, with comedy, I have two sides of comedy. One, I like comedy that just slaps me in the face, with my own experience. So, like, someone who I just love is Cat Williams. Cat, his voice, and just as a black person in America, like, so much of his comedy stems from that. And also the way he talks reminds me of an uncle or something I grew up with. So I really like him. But he's also really smart. And with comedy, I'm really driven by brilliance. So I really like Cat Williams. And and I hope this doesn't get you any backlash, I really like Dave Chappelle.
I'm happy to take backlash for Dave Chappelle. He's my favorite comic, and I won't back down from that because I know he's a loving guy, and I think all the backlash is a bunch of crap.
Yeah, and as a person who actually watched that particular special, I'll just say I think people need to watch it and actually see the special, because a lot of the people, and I have incredible friends and family members that are part of the LGBTQ plus community, and many of them who I've gotten into debates about that particular special, many of them hadn't watched it. So I say to them, I'm like, gotta watch it. But anyway, I say that to say I really like Dave Chappelle. I actually got a chance to meet him a couple times, and he is brilliant. He's absolutely brilliant as a person. So I like his comedy. I like Kevin Hart. I think for me, Kevin Hart's comedy isn't always funny, but I think he's a great storyteller. And I think that I love as a businessman and as an entrepreneur and branding person, like he is fucking brilliant.
Yeah.
Like I think he's one of the greatest social entrepreneurs that we will ever see. I mean, here's a guy who went from being like kind of, in C and B movies in like niche markets to now he is an international superstar. Like that is just sheer brilliance. So those are some people, and then obviously the GOATs, Eddie Murphy, Richard Pryor, all those guys. I think they're, Paul Mooney.
Yeah, rest in peace.
Paul Mooney's great. Great writer, great comedian. I love people who make me think, and they use comedy as a tool to get some really unique information into your mind. So yeah, I've never been asked that before, man. So
yeah, like I said, I'm a big stand-up nerd. I love talking about it. And I've done some open mics. I've had a lot of stand-ups on the show, and to me, there's so many similarities, especially when you're talking about improvised music and just and what you can learn from the art and how you can reach an audience, and just how, like, I don't know, just how much joy they both bring me and audiences. So it's always cool to hear what other people have gotten from it. And as far as the whole Dave Chappelle thing goes, it's like I too have friends who are part of the transgender community, and nothing Dave Chappelle has ever said has inspired any ill will in me. And I get some of the things being controversial and even disliked, but at the end of the day, he seems like such a true artist, and it's art first and all love above that. So I'm glad you're not afraid to talk about it, because I'm not either. Like that's just how I digest it, and I don't blame anyone for being offended. But to me, it's all love in that art, and he's such a amazing artist, just in my opinion.
And I think for me, that's why I said, like, I'm not going to speak on either side, because I'm very careful about never wanting to be misquoted or misread. But what I will say is, there are even things that he has said that were offensive to black folks, or even one of my closest friends and mentors is a Jewish person, and there were things that he even said that were anti-Semitic, like. And so I think, and my friend and I, we spoke about it. And I think, what I think is interesting about Dave is that nobody's off the table for him.
Yeah.
And so I think that for me is why I said, like, whether, we support or say he shouldn't talk about whatever. But again, as you said, which was really profound, which is like art above everything. Like, I think there's a space where when you create art, and particularly comedy, where it is the place where you can discuss things that can't get discussed anywhere else. Comedy is sort of the table that you can sit at and talk about differences and say things. It's like the safe zone. And so, yeah, if we no longer have, just like the bandstand is that place where we can explore as jazz musicians and we can try things. If all of a sudden now we can no longer do that, then it changes the discipline and it changes the genre and changes, what we do. So, I separate from his, this last special, I think he is a brilliant comedic mind, that definitely deserves, the ability to have his work recognized, because he's brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely. He deserves the controversy too, but just because that's part of comedy, and I don't think anyone should silence him. I think it's just you got to acknowledge when you disagree. It's not, it's just part of the comedy. But I
absolutely,
but it makes people talk more, and I think it does more good than harm. And I don't know. It's just interesting to talk about with anyone. So it's nice to touch on that. But really, all the stuff we've gotten to talk about, I am just glad you gave me the time to do it. It's so good to have you on the show. It's so cool to hear from an artist of such a high profile as you, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more of your work. Can you tell the audience one more time what they should be looking out for and where they should look for you online?
Yeah, man, UlyssesOwensJr.com. Instagram, Ulysses Owens Jr. _ Facebook, Ulysses Owens Jr., Twitter, Ulysses Owens Jr. And yeah, man, I'm pretty easy to find. And as I said, I have the show coming up at Dizzy's with my big band December 2nd through the 5th. And then, check the website. We got a bunch of stuff happening in 2022, so I'm excited about it.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you so much, Ulysses. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Brett.